intersects with American religious history, and that will take some doing. So a couple of quick questions in chat. I know if we're going to be in person next week. That's almost certainly the case. I don't see any reason why we wouldn't be doing that. And it's almost like we could have been doing that today, but it's probably safer to just keep through the week. The recordings, I made a mistake the other day, and I thought I was recording, but I actually wasn't. Hence the Zoom. I was out of practice with Zoom. So today's is recording. So I don't see any reason why I wouldn't make it available if for some reason that would be helpful. Let us complete the preliminary materials that have to do with overviewing major topics, and then we'll embark on a more ambitious approach to looking at how Christianity was transplanted to the Americas in the particular forms that it took. So when we left off the other day, I was introducing still the concepts of religious freedom or freedom of religion as one of the great principles of what I like to call the American experiment, and trying to put it into the context of the time and place in which it was first conceived, which was not exclusively, so I didn't mean to give the impression that it was exclusively Christian, but it was predominantly Christian oriented. So the denominational forms of Christianity that had been multiplying over the centuries on the continent and in England were the primary focus for religious freedom. And of course, there were probably many obviously good reasons for tolerance of diversity within Christianity, simply for pragmatic purposes, political purposes. But so the conceptualization of freedom in terms of allowing for multiple forms of Christianity to thrive and flourish was an expedient, strategic decision on the part of both the founding fathers, but also, of course, even prior to that, in terms of political stability. Now, I think because this is not a history of the United States class, but a history of religion in the United States class, I do want to put a little bit more of a laser-like focus on that particular area. So one of the ways that I think it's really interesting to talk about religion is that we have not only a lot of different ways to define religion, and I've tried to introduce one which I think is fairly helpful. But typically when we think of religion today, we might associate it with beliefs and practices and groups and rituals, certain places that we identify with religion or as religious sites. And we've kind of grown accustomed to a certain level of tolerance and appreciation for difference and recognition of difference. And it's perhaps a little disorienting to think that maybe previous generations didn't have that same attitude toward religion. So one of the ways that I think it could be a little jarring for us today is to look back on this early historical era and realize that religion was not seen that way 200, 300 years ago. So one way to immediately jar us into that recognition, I thought would be helpful, is to juxtapose the freedom of religion, which we all recognize now as one of the really great ideas of America, and to contrast it with what was happening at the very same time to indigenous peoples in the Americas. And so it might be a helpful way for us to kind of reckon with the fact that things are not what they seem. And so let's do it in such a way where I could say, when the principle of religious freedom was introduced, it did not necessarily include other groups that we would identify as possessing religion. And perhaps I think, just instead of just keep beating around the bush, I'll kind of just come out with it. Okay, so religious freedom is only valid insofar as it's sort of universally and equally extended. And so one of the twin themes that I like to play with in this class is contrasting it with religious prohibition. And one of the sort of sadder moments, actually it's more of an era than a moment, is the prejudicial prohibition of indigenous religion through a very long stretch of time in the history of the United States. So this quotation that I'm using on this slide was part of United States law from the years 1883 to 1934. So a 50-year period that marks, ironically, both the founding of the academic study of religion, as well as the founding of the academic discipline of anthropology. So we have some really interesting parallels that take place academically, politically, and of course, socially, that we need to register to keep things in the proper context. So it says here, and this was part of the ongoing, what we would call the ongoing Indian wars that were taking place throughout the 19th century. And one of the ways that we can really track what the attitude towards the natives, now one of you guys was commenting on the nomenclature of, Native American versus American Indian versus Indian, and we can talk about that. But for now, I'm just going to sort of repeat what is put into United States law. So the concept was the typical term for indigenous people then was Indian. So any Indian who engages or continues to engage in the practices of holy men or medicine men, they're so-called medicine men, or who keeps the Indians of the reservation from adopting and following civilizing habits and pursuits, or uses the arts of conjurer to prevent Indians from abandoning their barbarous rites and customs, shall be deemed guilty of an offense, and upon conviction will be imprisoned for not less than 10 days. And so rather than recognizing indigenous practices and beliefs, places and peoples as possessing and practicing what we would call religion, whatever they thought was taking place among indigenous people was not regarded as religion, and it was regarded as so offensive that it was prohibited by law. And this was United States law for the 50 years that I've already mentioned. And it really, even though the religious prohibition laws were sort of quietly receding in 1934, it was not until the 1978 American Indian Freedom of Religion Act that it was rehabilitated to allow for a variety of practices among American Indians to actually begin practicing under the protection of law. So for most of the 20th century, indigenous peoples throughout North America were not allowed to practice their ancestral rites and customs, and that sort of shadow of prohibition lays over the history of the United States and its history of religion. So I think you can make out in the bolded font some of the ideas or attitudes towards the indigenous culture. So I'm just going to be curious about what you make of that vocabulary or that language, and the attitudes that they reveal, because so much of what we want to do today is going to be sort of more in the realm of psychology, in terms of attitudes and predispositions, rather than sort of assembling a dry list of facts. Oh, okay, go ahead, Alexis.
Could you repeat that?
Ah,
I know that's not it's not like you're like I can't like, rewind you or something, but
no, I know. I'm so sorry. I like a one-off thing. I never know what I just said.
don't worry.
Yeah. But I am curious to hear from anyone about how you read the passage, maybe, and what you make of the attitudes that they reveal. Yeah. Okay, Josh, shoot.
Yeah, I think first thing that is noted is this so-called use, where it automatically almost delegitimizes their religion, or even their terminology, where it's like, this is what they call themselves, this so-called,
Right.
automatically inferiorizes them. But then to use a term like barbarous rites, I mean, it sparks the imagination that they're doing something that should be illegal or doing something that is immoral, But it is sort of ironic using the term barbarous, since, again, the Greek connotation is people who don't speak the language,
Right. Yeah.
Again, it's an interesting use of words, but it automatically sets up in the imagination that they're doing something so horrendous that it can't even be described. When in fact, if you saw a medicine man doing what he's doing, it's probably akin to a dance or a song, rather than anything, bloody or terrible. Where if you describe to a Native American or indigenous person who's never been in contact with Christianity that you're going to consume the blood and body of your God, and that to them may be extremely barbarous and off-putting. So again, the relative use of this is, I guess, not surprising compared to the treatment of the Native Americans, throughout the 19th century, especially. But at the same time, it should be surprising to us today, I think.
Great. Yeah, really good comment there, Josh. I think I have to be really honest with everyone, and I'd have to admit that throughout my going to high school up through college, no one ever told me this. I never learned that we, as a nation, had prohibited an entire group, race, nation, tribes of people, stopped them from being able to do what they thought was natural expressions of their religion. And it was shocking when I first encountered it. I really don't even remember when I did, but it still shocks me. And it's still, it's kind of like I still don't quite know how to process it. And yet I think without it, I wouldn't understand the history of religion at all. So I'm grateful that it kind of just showed up at some point in my studies, and I've been kind of just dealing with it ever since. And I think that given the nature of our topic, we're looking at the history of religion. I think it helps us understand how religion was viewed. In traditional Christian terms that were inherited from antiquity, it was a very long and convoluting process where there was a lot of competition and rivalry between different religious forms. But ultimately, of course, Christianity triumphs over all other religions that were competition. And it essentially was able to define religion on its own terms, right? So it was able to consolidate the legacy of antiquity in such a way where religion could be defined as reflecting and mirroring the Christian tradition. And so all other forms of religion were regarded as heathenish, or as pagan, or as just simply false religion. Now, I really appreciate Joshua's picking up on the language of barbarism, and of course it has its own etymological origin, but it's simply a way of looking at the scale of human development as well. In terms of looking at the development of religion, one could say, well, there's primitive religion, there's savage, there's barbarism, and then there's civilized. And of course, with Christianity at the sort of triumphant peak of that arc, true religion was Christianity. All other religions were false religion, and they were just simply variations of falsity, rather than recognizing equality between religions. And so it's sort of a legacy we've inherited. It's a little bit of a shameful one, perhaps. And we are still in the process of rehabilitating not only our treatment of indigenous peoples and indigenous religion, but also our attitudes towards their practices and beliefs. And so it's kind of a good way to check ourselves and to realize that despite the beautiful or even noble ideal of religious freedom, it was always juxtaposed with the failure to recognize the equality of religion across the board. And there's no more glaring an example of that than the actual outlawing of religion for the greater part of the 20th century for those who were here first. Okay, so nowadays, of course, we shy away from this type of rhetoric and language. So, okay, Shirella, you're asking, or you're saying, making a comment. It seems like the Indians were hated on and viewed as savages and as barbaric, and everyone else just wanted them locked up. Yeah, I think that's correct. And I'm experimenting with my treatment of indigenous religion here. Normally, in previous years, I would have put this up front more. I would have focused on indigenous religion up front, but I'm trying to do something different, and so I'm kind of glossing over some things, but we will be looking at indigenous religion far more systematically a little bit later on. But for now, I just definitely wanted to show that it's an area that needs to be problematized for us, rather than just neglected or assumed that, oh yeah, for sure it included American Indians because freedom of religion, of course, we would have given it to them too. I think this reveals that these were in the early days of defining or even understanding religion, and religion was not extended as to everyone. So it would even be debatable. And I think this is an important point, specifically in terms of first contact with indigenous peoples. They did not even have religion. And I think that's one of Christopher Columbus's sort of famous one-liners, is like, it seemed to me that they didn't even have a religion. So what better way to essentially colonize an entire continent and population if they didn't have anything even remotely resembling what we would call religion? And Boy, thank you for your comment. I think because the religious practices are based on animistic or anthropomorphic deities, not the Christian God, also because the practices could be seen as close to witchcraft and natural medicine. Yeah, that's an excellent point you're making, Boy. So I definitely agree with that. One of the things that we'll look at today is the sort of frontier psychology of American Pilgrims and Puritans, which definitely remembers from both biblical tradition and antiquity a certain anxiety towards the animistic or the pagan or what we would now call indigenous religious attitudes close to nature, interacting with spirits and with nature forces. So you're absolutely right that this would have sort of been reminiscent of that type of thought, and it was regarded as diabolical, evil, or certainly dangerous and prohibited by biblical mandate. Okay, moving on. And again, we will be returning to this concept. But so one of the themes that we looked at already on day one was the concept of a city on a hill. And so I wanted to just sort of flesh that out a little bit more. And it's another way to illustrate the use of religious rhetoric, biblical language, and how it intersects or overlaps with political ideas and ideology. So, A City on a Hill has a lot of really interesting historical moments in America. But of course, as we might recall, the first instance of its appearance as a phrase, as an idea, is in the Gospels, and particularly in the Gospel of Matthew, where it's Jesus who essentially likens his disciples to, metaphorically speaking, to being a city on a hill in terms of their light. So if they are obedient and faithful disciples, they will radiate a kind of divine light, and that light can be likened to a city shining on a hill. And it's just kind of a fun idea that, it's kind of like they become a beacon of illumination for others and not to be hidden. And this gets picked up by the first Puritans as emblematic of America, that the American experiment, the Puritan social formation on the East Coast, could be a new city shining on a hill. And it enters into Puritan discourse, and it becomes a symbol of America in its earliest sort of ideal stages. And it's one way that we can sort of see a trafficking of biblical idealism into the American sort of discourse. And then it becomes a kind of stock in trade rhetorical flourish. And it gets resurrected once again in more recent years by Ronald Reagan, who picks it up and once again uses it. But in this case, in terms of elevating America as an exceptional nation and sort of overlapping with the rise of the American right. Right, so we have once again a kind of remembering of an ancient religious idea inherited from Christian tradition that becomes an early ideal in America, and then it gets retooled, repurposed for our current era. And so people may not even know where it comes from, but they know what it represents, and therefore it's helpful to kind of see the thread over history, and that even people who don't know where it first comes from, they know what they hear when they hear it, and they recognize its significance. There's something religious-y about America, and even if it's not articulated precisely, it's sort of subterranean, and they're in a subterranean way. All right, so I have a question for everyone before I move on to a new slide, and my question would be this. So in studying religion, sometimes different scholars approach it in different ways, and one way that some scholars like to approach religion is to look at how religion functions. So sometimes it's called the functionalist school of religious theory, or the functionalist theories of religion. And so one way to think about this, and please think with me, we look for the beliefs and the practices and the places and the people that could be said to work religiously. And so, let me give you an example. So we could say, let me make this a good analogy. Thinking on my feet sometimes is not always that easy. But so religion you could say, let's say Christianity, just for the sake of argument. Christianity functions like a religion because it brings people together. They all have the same belief system. They all share similar practices. They all can worship at the same place. They all recognize each other's symbols, like the cross or certain other, obvious visual cues that you're in the same group. And so there's a certain coherence and solidarity to religion. And even if you didn't necessarily know what the religion was, completely about, you would recognize that you were in a religious environment. So my question to everyone is, can you think of any symbols or beliefs, practices, ideas, places even, where American identity, American political identity functions like a religion? Okay, Boy, thank you. I think I got your pronouncing your name right. But allegiance to the flag is a perfect example. So we have the flag, which is our national sort of, symbol of identity, and the reverence that we're supposed to show to the flag, even though it's just a piece of cloth, elevates it way beyond that piece of cloth, and it becomes a kind of overarching, unifying symbol that so closely approximates the divine or something religious-y that it does function like a religious symbol. Excellent. So, Catherine, I see your hand, so I'm all ears.
Hi, I was actually going to point out what Miss Cecilia just said in the comment section. I was thinking of like getting sworn in either as president or getting sworn in like on the House floor, like when laws are being passed, like you have to do certain things before those political events can like begin. So I was just thinking of situations like that.
Absolutely right. Yeah. So it's the appeal to religious authority, divine authority, placing your hand on a Bible, swearing an oath, all of that is religious rhetoric, religious symbolism. And so absolutely right. Cecilia, you're absolutely right. Sacralization of the legal system, almost like our Constitution is a sacred text. It is a kind of sacred document, almost as if the founding fathers were prophets or new Moseses or something, and what they wrote was divinely inspired and must be protected for forever. Oaths, absolutely right. Joshua, political parties, shared ideals, symbols like the elephant and the donkey, absolutely right. Jacob, ritual of the national anthem, absolutely. There's definitely language embedded within the national anthem. Definitely military parades, absolutely. Lots more to choose from. If anyone has any further suggestions, but we're looking for ways where American identity functions symbolically, sometimes actually really, in a kind of functionalist religious way. Thanksgiving, maybe, yes. Certainly there are religious overtones to the Thanksgiving holiday. Now, Sharella, you've got money. Is it an S or is that money? I don't really know. But if it is money, I would invite everyone to grab money. I would invite anyone to grab a dollar bill and tell the rest of us what do you read when you see what's on that dollar bill. I don't have one in front of me, but yes, I do. There it is. Okay, in God we trust. Absolutely right. Right. So, in today's sort of religious vocabulary, certain theorists prefer the term American civil religion, which is a kind of nice handle on what we're trying to get to here, which is that in certain instances, in fact, quite a few, American identity, political identity, has so many representative symbols that implicitly and explicitly invoke religious language, religious ideas, and religious meaning, that one could make the really strong argument, and it has been made, that we actually are participating in what we could call a civil religion, in the sense that we almost unwittingly participate in religious discourse simply by being American. And it's not like we can withdraw from that participation. The back of a $20 bill says, "In God We Trust," over the White House. That's pretty good. Yeah, that's getting really specific. So whether it's the Pledge of Allegiance, where we pledge our allegiance to the flag under God, or whether it is the introduction of "In God We Trust" onto our daily currency, or, as it's already been noted, as we must, almost every single president since the history of the beginning has invoked the blessing of God, in some kinds of ways exclusively blessing the United States of America. And of course, we don't need to go much further than the Declaration of Independence, where it says all men are created equal. It's very difficult to be created unless there is a creator. And so from inception until January 16th, 2025, we are daily participating in a functionalist religious discourse. Now, extra credit for anyone. Well, let's see, extra credit. I'm always silly about this. I don't give extra credit for this, but I'm really curious to hear if anyone knows when exactly was the Pledge of Allegiance and the "In God We Trust" inscribed into our currency and into our Pledge of Allegiance, and under what conditions and circumstances. All right, Josh. Josh is running up for it.
I believe it wasn't until like the 1920s that we started putting "In God We Trust" on the currency, and then start really demanding the Pledge of Allegiance, like in schools and public arenas. The context is where I get a little bit lost, but I do know it wasn't until like 100 years ago that this became a thing. I think it was under Wilson, but I could be wrong about that.
Well, you came so close. I hate to disappoint you. It's actually under Eisenhower in the 1950s. Yeah, but very close. Yeah. So first and foremost, it is not something that's always been with us. So it is a recent development. And so, Andrew, you hit it right on the head. Sorry. During the Cold War, in contrast to the atheist Soviet Union. So it's a really interesting moment in our history where, despite having somehow survived without having "In God We Trust" and "Under God" in the Pledge of Allegiance and our currency for at least a couple hundred years, or 100-something plus years, in the 1950s, under the threat of a Soviet expansionism, which was regarded as an atheistic threat, Eisenhower decided that he didn't really care what kind of God you would pray to or you believed in, as long as there was a God that was available for America. And so it was proposed as a conservative reaction to the threat of Soviet atheism, and it was introduced, though both of these principles were introduced into our American discourse in the 1950s. And we just take it for granted ever since that this is essentially how we are to proceed. And so if you don't believe in God, I'm really sorry, but this is how it works. And so the concept of invoking "In God We Trust," it's very difficult, I think, to even how are we separating church and state, and like what exactly haven't the lines now just been blurred, irreparably, by invoking this type of overarching providential benevolence. And what about atheists? What about people who don't have a God? What are they supposed to do? What are they supposed to do with the Pledge of Allegiance? So American civil religion is problematic because it doesn't apply to all citizens equally. And it's certainly exclusive in the sense that it seems to presuppose belief as normative. And it alienates, I think, quite a few people from being able to feel like they are participating as equal members of a civil, secular society. Another thing that's really interesting, which I haven't touched on yet, invoking the Declaration of Independence, which we'll get to, is that despite Jefferson's language of the creator, or being created, all men being created, it's not clear, in fact, it's actually not at all apparent that Jefferson was invoking the Christian God either. And so, as we will be learning, there were different conceptualizations of deity among the founding fathers, and it's almost indisputable that Jefferson was invoking the deist God, which is by definition not a Christian God as such. And in a way, it's a nice parallel to Eisenhower's introduction of "In God We Trust," because Eisenhower wasn't necessarily invoking the Christian God, but simply a kind of friendly God concept that would allow for the most inclusive recognition of divinity in America. But again, still invoking the language of a creator and presuming its normativity. Yeah. Okay, great. So I think that pretty much wraps up for now our preliminary issues of introductory material. Carlos, by all means, ask away.
Professor, I just have a curiosity question. If someone is allowed to, for example, if they go to court or they have to swear to tell the truth and they put the hand on the Bible, if that's like a requirement for everyone, or if like someone could say, I refuse to put my hand on the Bible, but I still swear to tell the truth or something like that.
Yeah, it's a great question. I know there's a little wiggle room in terms of the type of sacred book you're able to use. And it'd be an interesting area to see how much wiggle room there actually is. Catherine, do you have anything you want to?
I recently saw a video from the state floor, and I'm pretty sure it was a Georgian political official from the Republican Party. And I'm not sure what the situation was, but someone was trying to swear something on not a Bible, and he was saying you can't do that. And even though he's a political official on the state floor, he was not aware that you didn't have to use the Christian Bible. And so it's just interesting to see that even our political officials who have been sworn into this country, they don't even know that you can use any sacred book technically.
Right. Yeah. So there is some wiggle room. Of course, it's not popular to invoke the Quran, for example, or Charles Darwin's Origin of Species or something. But I think the latitude is present, as you say. Yes. Michael, thank you, Josh. You answered that really well. Didn't Thomas Jefferson write his own Bible? And he absolutely did. We'll be getting to that. It's really one of the most interesting things in American history, the idea that you can write your own Bible. And he did it, but, when we get to it, we'll learn that, he really wasn't, he didn't really promote it publicly. And he kept it a private thing for himself only. And he's a deist. He was a deist, who objected to the Christian concept of God and the Christian revelation. Okay, so yeah, I don't think it's really all that difficult to reconstruct the history of the rise of Christian nationalism, given the context of America's founding. And so we will kind of leave this hanging for now, because it's really the climax of this narrative arc that I'm trying to portray. But as I said early on day one, the concept of America being a Christian nation is one of the more complicated questions for us, and it needs a little unpacking and untangling, and different people will answer it differently, including many of you present today, and so it will be an interesting thing to wrestle with and to reckon with as we go forward, and I'm not going to sort of prejudicially answer the question. So what I'm hoping to do next with what we have left today is to begin to unpack the history of Christianity as it is imported or transplanted to the Americas. And one way to begin is to just quote from some of the first arrivals on the scene. And here's one of the earliest accounts of arrival, and in a way introducing the psychological attitude and excitement, but also anxiety that faced the first pilgrims or Puritans as they arrived. Not, these weren't Puritans, but pilgrims. So having thus arrived, or being thus arrived in that good harbor and brought safe to land, they fell on their knees and blessed the God of heaven. What could they see but a hideous and desolate wilderness full of wild beasts and wild men? So really interesting insight into how the arrival of European and continental, particularly this was English, how English settlers first encountered the new lands, the new world, both in terms of the excitement of all of the adventure promising and awaiting them, but also a certain lurking fear of wild places, the wild animals, and of course the wild peoples that were untamed, barbarous, as we've seen, and kind of opening up some areas of psychological anxiety that would probably haunt the American imagination for decades, if not centuries. So, we could look at that and expand it into how they viewed Indian peoples, how they were going to view the threat of, the rising slave trade and the threat of, the African population kind of rising up and violently reacting to their enterprise, how enemies within, enemies without, fear of women and their power, and also, of course, just the rising fear of the devil. So we're going to see a lot of that anxiety play out in time. But for now, what I want to do is provide a window into the history of Christianity, really broadly speaking, so that we can build up to understanding the Puritan mindset more specifically. So bear with me. For those of you who are really comfortable with the history of Christianity, this might be a little tedious. I'm not going to try to reconstruct everything or replete everything, but if you have curiosities about how Christianity developed, or particularly in the post-Reformation era, this might be helpful as a sort of refresher. So let's begin by Oh yeah, there's a little bit more there. Let's begin by kind of doing the quickest possible gloss on how Christianity was first developed or conceived in antiquity. And forgive me for not being able to flesh this out more properly, but I would say that among many other factors that you could say as consolidating, I would want to make the case that these principles of the Christian theological tradition are sort of non-negotiable for most. And then we could build on that, but I think without this sort of foundation, one, you can't understand Christianity, but also this allows for a kind of common consensus among Christians that I still think holds. Okay, so I call it the Christian theological tradition. You can kind of make out on my slide, which is why I like it, that Jesus is kind of up there floating, almost invisible, but you trust that he's there, and it's a representation of a kind of metaphysical dimensionality. And of course, it refers to a kind of heavenly existence. But so to bear with me as I walk through this. So something happened in antiquity to inspire Jesus's followers to recognize him as the fulfillment of the Israelite prophecy, right? So Jesus is the Messiah for his followers, and translated into the Greek language, he becomes known as Christos, or transliterating as Christ. So he becomes the central figure of Christian tradition, and he transforms that tradition by not only by his life, but certainly by his death, and then by his perceived resurrection from the dead. One of the ways that Christianity is so distinctive is not simply because it recognizes a Messiah concept, which was normative in Judaism at that time, but because he was believed to have been raised from the dead. And not just raised from the dead, but also promising a return in the immediate future. So the concept of a second coming of Jesus, the idea that Jesus's resurrection was really the first step in a general resurrection, becomes programmatic for every Christian generation, and therefore built into the system of the Christian theological tradition is an inherent heightened expectation of return. So every generation has expected Jesus's return imminently, and so technically this is known as the parousia, the arrival or the return or the presence of Jesus, which is euphemistically just called the second coming. And this is no more, this is just as, or no more as, or just as pertinent to American history as it was 1,000 years ago. Every generation expects the return of Jesus, and ours is no exception to that. When Jesus does return, there will be an end-time judgment. There will be conflict and violence and fire and brimstone and the whole thing. And this is not a bad thing, but it's a good thing because it will bring in salvation of the world for those who are redeemed. Jesus' death is an atoning sacrifice, meaning he reconciles the human and the divine. It was a divinely predestined gift from God to humanity. And Jesus's surrender to death and his willingness to die is essentially what elevates him to the status of divinity, or returns him to his rightful status of divinity. And Jesus is enshrined as the Lord or as God, using the Greek term that is both synonymous for the word for God in Hebrew, but also Jesus's sort of proper name as Lord. One of the last developments in Christian theology is the identification of Jesus as God in technical terms, using the concept of a trinity of divine persons, with Jesus, the Holy Spirit, and God as three equal but distinctive persons. And even though this is not a concept very clearly developed in the Gospels, it becomes a philosophical and metaphysical way to reconcile Jesus's humanity and God. And so whether you're a Christian, Catholic, Orthodox, Protestant, and any variation thereof, these tend to be, with some exceptions, these tend to be the common denominators of religious identity. And so it's helpful, I think, at least in the beginning of a discussion of Christian religion, to identify the common denominators of Christian identity, Christian religious identity, because sometimes the differences between Christians are so exaggerated and overemphasized that it's easy to forget the commonalities. Okay. So this would suffice for most people as the sort of fundamental, foundational, reconstructed view of early Christian thought about Jesus. It's not exhausted, but it's sufficient. As Christianity becomes consolidated in antiquity, we enter into the era of Christendom, which is one way of talking about how Christianity becomes the one and only religion of antiquity. And so Christendom is properly defined as the conceptual unity of Christian identity from the end of antiquity, so around 400 or so, to the middle, through the Middle Ages, probably all the way up until the Renaissance or the Reformation. So it's conceptual unity because there were obviously already splits within the Christian church, but the idea that everyone in Europe, especially, was Christian, and if you weren't, you were sort of on the outside of that conceptual unity. This is what is meant by the unity or the lack of separation between church and state. That the fusion of the state apparatus, the empire's engine of organization, fused with the church, as particularly the Catholic Church, what predominantly marks the Christian tradition. So for 1,000 years, so from say 400 to 1400 or so, one could say that there was an unquestioned superiority and triumphalism of Christianity, particularly Catholicism, in Europe, and it was unquestioned, and it's a legacy that was so unquestioned that those foundational views of what reality was about couldn't necessarily be threatened by them. So my sort of quick sketch here is Christian origins from the very beginning. It's a very early period. Early Christianity is only the pre-Constantinian, and by the way, this is Constantine, the emperor who legalizes Christianity in the year 312, and which is why he's larger than life. And he represents the divide between the persecuted years of the first 300 or so years and the post-Constantinian era where the church is born as an institution. One thing that unites Christians from then until today is the recitation of the Nicene Creed, which was formulated under Constantine in the 4th century. And he essentially facilitated that consolidation, the idea that there was one church, one creed, ultimately one canon, and essentially one kind of Christian that would recognize the foundational ideas inherited by the various streams of Christian thought. So, yeah, very quick sketch. I recognize that, but necessary in order to provide a foundation for what comes next. The idea that this unity represented by Christendom would last forever was probably a dream that's too good to be true. But in the centuries building up to the Reformation, we start seeing cracks in the system and many fissures entering through those cracks that began to weaken that concept of unity and the authority of the Pope, the failure of the authority of the church. And I'm marking in by bullet pointing a few areas where we could say, yes, there's where the church begins to lose its luster or its ability to command authority. The launching of failed crusades is one of many examples where we could paint a picture of loss of popular authority. The schisms, both within the church, of competition among competing popes in the 14th century, excuse me, and also the schism within or between the Orthodox and the Catholic Church that really came to a head in the year 1054, were both instrumental in weakening the authority and the prestige of the church. In the 14th century, also the Black Death, the bubonic plague that wiped out a third of the European population, was a further example of how church authority was weakened. Go ahead, Joshua.
Just curious, the Great Schism within the papacy of 1300 to 1400, yeah. Is that whenever the basically the leadership of the Catholic Church moved to France?
That's right.
Avignon? Okay.
Yeah. The relocation of the papacy to Avignon in the 14th century led to a crisis within the church. And at one point, and it took over 100 years to resolve the problem. And at one point, there were 3 competing popes at the same time. And a lot of deposed popes that needed to be removed. So by the end of that period, by the beginning of the 15th century, it was really quite clear that the concept of a sort of divinely mandated and authorized pope was kind of up for grabs. Like, it wasn't like there was one pope and everyone regarded it like a royal bloodline of popes or something. It wasn't like that. And so it had been highly politicized by that point. And so it was malleable in the hands of those who thought that reform was now necessary. And so I'm only just trying to paint a picture because this is all pre-American history, but it shows us that the Catholic Church had entered an era of instability and lack of cohesion and lack of popular authority. And so it gave rise to various reform movements that sought to destabilize even further the authority and the sort of consolidated power of the church. So enter the Reformation then, where we begin to see now under the leadership of Martin Luther a direct challenge to the Catholic Church. Now, there were precedent reformers, but their fates didn't end all that well, because the authority of the church was still quite supreme, and they had the power of excommunication and execution, of course, at their disposal. So the first sort of launch of a direct attack on the Catholic system was leveraged by Martin Luther, who was, of course, a Catholic priest, a Catholic monk, and a Catholic professor at a German university. And when he recognized that the current sale of what became a kind of scandalous practice of selling indulgences for the construction of St. Peter's in Rome, a scandalous practice because it was exploitative of the religious vulnerabilities of the population. And the sale of indulgences was a kind of free market enterprise from some rather mischievous Catholic huckster. In some ways, it was never really meant to be the way that it was exploited, but nonetheless, it was a popular approach to solving a religious problem. So a little bit of a backstory. One of the sacraments in Catholicism was known as penance, capital P, penance. Now it's called reconciliation. But penance was the system in place that facilitated the forgiveness of sins through a several step process of contrition and confession, and then finally acts of works of satisfaction that would allow for the forgiveness of sins to be facilitated by a Catholic priest, right? So it's one of the 7 sacraments, and one way that penance worked was that when you confessed your sins, a priest would recommend or require you to fulfill certain works, like say this many Our Fathers, or this many Hail Marys, or go on a pilgrimage, or provide this much charity, or and so there were certain assigned works that you would do in order to be absolved of your sin. And what was introduced in the system was the sale of certificates of indulgence that would allow for those who were requesting forgiveness of sin to be forgiven their sins, which would allow for less time to be spent in purgatory, with the place that you go after you die in advance of going to either hell or heaven, particularly heavens. But there'd be a little bit of a time spent in a kind of limbo land. And one of the ways that indulgences were attractive was it was suggested that the Catholic Church could shorten the amount of time that you would spend there. And so for a fee, you could pay in a way, you could pay for forgiveness. Now, Martin Luther objected to this concept of paying your way to heaven, in a sense. And he wrote a series of critiques, which are famously known as the 95 Theses. He challenged the authority of the Pope and the Church to be able to even do this type of indulgence offering. And as a result, really threatened the Church's authority and stature in the eyes of the populace. And he refused to recant his pronouncements and his theses, and he was summarily excommunicated by the Church, which required him then to really rethink how he was going to remain Christian, considering he was no longer recognized as such. And he essentially founded his own sort of denominational form of Christianity, which we now call Lutheranism, right? So he launches the Reformation, which was not intended to create a new religion. It was intended to reform the Catholic Church. And the Church, in a sense, met Luther halfway by instituting some reforms, but it also refused to let go of its ultimate authority and sacramental system, and therefore they just had loggerheads towards each other and essentially parted ways. And so we now see, beginning with Luther, an entire series of reformers in the footsteps of Luther, also beginning to challenge the authority of the Catholic Church and creating their own denominational forms of Christianity. So, Shirella, what is this term called? I'm not sure what you're referring to. Okay, never mind. Okay, so another reformer is named, the one not intended to create a new religion. So I'm referring to Martin Luther. So one of the things that now represents popular Christianity is the idea that Protestantism and Catholicism are two separate religions. And so often you might even hear that you could either be a Catholic or you could be a Christian. And it's an odd way to talk about it, but I'm just reiterating that Luther did not intend to create a new religion. He intended to reform the Catholic Church. And because the Catholic Church didn't cooperate in Luther's estimation, he had no choice but to institute a new form of Christianity that didn't require the church. And because of the necessity of reformation of the Christian tradition, we end up with a new Bible, a new liturgy, a new theology, a new way of being Christian in the world, and a new sacramental system with no popes, no 7 sacraments. And so the entire structure of the Christian tradition that had been inherited for 1,000 years was destabilized by the Reformation. John Calvin is another reformer, kind of a colleague of Martin Luther. He also criticizes the sacrament of penance. He denies the reality, the sort of transubstantive reality of the Eucharist. So it's not Jesus who's being, it's not really Jesus's body and blood that are being consumed. It's just symbolic of Jesus's body and blood. So he challenges the actual sacramental experience of the Catholic Church, and he introduces new theological ideas, particularly that of predestination, to introduce a different form of precisely who is saved. So it is not enough to be born into the church as a kind of guarantee that you're going to be saved, but now an anxiety has entered into the Christian psyche. And this is really my takeaway for you guys. It's like the idea that Christianity is stable, or that it is somehow coherent and secure, may be true more for Catholics than for Protestants. The Protestant imagination has been from its inception one of anxiety, because when you remove the structure of the Catholic Church from the Christian tradition, you lose at least 1,000 years of that consolidated tradition. And you lose the stability, the foundation, the structure, and some of the trappings. But you lose so much of what gave birth to the tradition and sort of nursed it and nurtured it, that it led to quite a lot of existential anxiety on the part of Protestants. And it's really difficult to understand the history of Protestantism without that anxiety being registered. What I mean by anxiety is the loss of church structure, and the increasing denominationalism that takes place within the Protestant Reformation. So, for example, if we take a look more closely to home with the Anglican Church, now this is Henry VIII. You might all know Henry VIII's sort of famous story of, having been, within Catholicism, and then after Martin Luther decided to break, he thought, well, this is working for them. Why not give this one a try? So the story goes that he wanted a divorce from offered by the Pope. The Pope refused to grant him one, and I'm sure that's too simplistic a model, but nonetheless, he broke from the Catholic Church and created his own Church of England with himself at the top. And so the birth of Anglicanism, the idea that you could break now you could break away from the church, you could create your own form of Christianity, and you now had the work to do of deciding exactly what kind of Christianity you were going to practice. And so the birth of the Church of England in the 16th century launches a whole new era of English Christianity that we start seeing recognizable in America, right? And so this is the picture I want to paint, where we have a new Bible now being translated into English. We have no more official connection with Rome or the papacy or the sacramental system. Worship services are now taking place in English rather than in Latin. We actually have a very new way of going to church. The church service is completely different. The king's at the head of the church, or the queen is at the head of the church rather than the Pope. And the reasons for Henry VIII's break with Catholicism are not theological. They're not sacramental. They are political. They're economic. He takes the property of the Catholic Church and he absorbs it into his own kingdom. And so it becomes a political and economic expedient that has religious overtones, which is why many people in the United Kingdom, in England, thought that Henry VIII was cynically exploiting the Reformation, and he was not separating enough theologically and ideologically from Catholicism. So the birth of Puritanism is born in the reaction to Anglicanism. And this is the last thing I'll end with, because it's where we'll start next time. The idea that the Catholic Church, which needed to be purified and decorrupted and reformed, was the critique that the rise of Puritanism was heralding as the solution. So the word Puritan, as it becomes part of the American experiment, is the desire to purify the Anglican Church of Catholic corruption, right? So say it again. So the rise of Puritanism is the ideal of the Anglican Church needing to be purified of Catholic corruption. So Henry VIII was nominally Catholic. He didn't really alter that much about the Catholic tradition. Some of it was sort of window dressing, a little sort of like, changing this or that. But some people in England thought he hadn't gone far enough, and they wanted to go further to purify the Anglican Church. So this is why they were dissident. This is why they were subversive. This is why they were selected for colonization. These were not people welcome within England, because they were disobedient to the Church of England. And so what better way than to just sort of use them to settle and colonize the new lands? Okay, I think that's all I have time for. If you have questions, I'll stick around for a few minutes. By all means, ask away. But thank you for your attention. I know it's a lot to take in. But anyway, see you guys in person next time. And have a great weekend.
Hey, Professor, I have a quick question here.